question. Why doesn't the local or state government pay the whole freight? Now, the fact is, if it comes from the federal government, it's considered to be free money. But it turns out it's not free money. A federal taxpayer is paying for it, or it's being borrowed. And I guess I don't see why there's a distinction drawn between indebtedness on the part of states and local governments and that of the federal liability. Is there a distinction that is any more than, well, it's federal, so it's free, as opposed to no? We should have a different standard for local, state versus federal?
Gentlemen, yield to me.
I will.
We do have federal programs because we recognize that every child in this country ought to have an opportunity for good health, and that's why we have a Medicaid program with certain standards that all children be covered. The states may not be able to choose to pay for that if they did it on their own, and we have such a strong involvement in as you put it often on your side of the aisle, government takeover. Well, government's not taking over health care, but we are certainly trying to make sure that we spend less money in health care, and one of the best ways to do that is prevention. So for the federal government, there's a clear reason to spend the money. Now, we can handle that a lot better than the states. When we have a time like now where
reclaiming my time, I'm not quite sure why you can do it better than the states.
Well, I was going to give you an answer.
Reclaiming my time, if the only limiting factor for this program, as described in this amendment, is money, well, then those who are closest to the situation should know where to spend it, and that would be the local or state government. And California's got a lot of wealthy people.
Gentlemen, yield.
I will.
It is harder for the people at the local level during a time of recession, particularly, to raise the money. And what we need
reclaiming my time, then, my point being, there seems to be a perception that if it's federal, it's free money. That, sure, we don't have to raise it on a federal level. We just kind of, my gosh, borrow it. And there's no harm, no foul, because it's a future generation that pays it back.
This is not, if the gentleman would yield further,
I will.
This is not money that's going to it's going to programs, not to the states to help them with their budget. These are programs.
No, but I was told, reclaiming my time, that the reason that the state isn't funding it is because the state's out of money. But apparently the federal government is not. At least that's the perception of those who advocate for this deficit spending. I'm out of time, but I appreciate the conversation. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. There are further gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, these are all very good questions, and it also becomes a recipe if we follow them to their logical extreme, that the problems can be ignored by both the federal and the state level. The state and local level have a harder time raising money. L.A. County, for example, is the healthcare system of last resort, and yet they have that requirement under California law, and they are the least able to raise the money. States a little better off, but when everybody's having a difficult time paying for things, it really does become the burden of the federal government, which has a much greater say over the economy.
Well, the gentleman yield.
No, I'm not going to yield to you because I'm in the middle of my sentence, but I don't have to yield in the middle of a sentence until I've completed my thought. The federal government has a much better say over the economy. For example, with this recession, one of the best things we can do would be to make investments that the local governments couldn't possibly undertake, but can produce jobs. We ought to be doing a lot more infrastructure projects, because those are things that are needed throughout this country. For business to succeed, we need the infrastructure to be rebuilt. And no better time could this happen than now, when borrowing is low, the interest rates are low, and it would provide jobs. The thing that we have a disagreement on, I think, on a party line basis, is that I speak for myself, and I know many Democrats, but I don't want to be so presumptuous to speak for others, that if we make investments, it produces jobs. When people work, it produces income for them, and it produces more income for local and federal government coffers. One of the reasons why I think some of the cuts that are being proposed are so damaging is that those are cuts of people's jobs. And when they are uninsured, when they are unemployed, then it's tough for them. It's tougher on the local government. It's also tough for the federal government. I've heard many people on the other side of the aisle say, President Obama has seen in the last month a widening of the deficit. Well, of course, there's a widening of the deficit because he inherited a very deep recession, the biggest and most severe recession since the Great Depression. Well, you've got to deal with that problem, not act as if the dominant issue before us is how to cut people out of work because we're going to cut the expenditures for the jobs that they now have. We're talking about a very small amount of money to keep people healthier, and that should come from the federal government because we're better able to handle it. We can control the economy better. We can get people working faster. Hopefully we can do things that are fair and providing more just opportunities in the economic patterns of our country. That's why I think it's important that we do this at the federal level. The states and local governments will not have the ability to do it until times get better. And when times are better, states can do more things. But until we get people to work and do some of the things that are important for the future for people to get jobs and work, all these other cuts like the savaging of Medicare and Medicaid that's being proposed in the budget, I think will have a negative impact on the economy and certainly a negative impact on middle class and lower income people. Who's asking me to yield?
Cassidy over here, I'm sorry.
Yes, yield to you.
Maybe the real difference between the two sides of the aisle is I see no difference from a taxpayer writing a check to L.A. County and that same taxpayer writing a check to California, the state of California, and to the federal government. I mean, the fact is the same taxpayer just spreading it 3 different places. Now, there's again a perception that the check going to the federal government is an expandable check, that somehow there's no reason it has to be based into the income of the nation, but rather it's just free money. Now,
well, let me reclaim
lots of wealth. I'm sorry.
Reclaiming my time, I don't agree with that. I know you stated that it's free money if it's coming from Washington, but I don't agree with that. A taxpayer, we have a broader base of federal taxpayers to do things in the federal and the national interest. We ought not to take on everything because we do have a system of government where we have local governments as well as the federal government. This is a responsibility, I believe, for the national government, especially since we're spending so much money in the health care services area. Medicaid and Medicare and other public health things come from Washington, and we ought to continue, and we'll let the states and local governments do other things, but this is already a clear responsibility, and I think we are better able to handle it.
Gentlemen.